It's 2025, a new year and the best time to turn your great idea into a business. Shopify is how you're going to make it happen. Let me tell you how. Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sale. Get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates. All you need to do is drag and drop. Their powerful social media tools let you connect all your channels and create shoppable posts. Established in 2025. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/promo. All lowercase. Go to shopify.com/promo to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/promo.
What is Dax, are you?
Tracking all our cars on Carvana Value Tracker on all our devices? Yes, Kristen, yes I am.
Well, I've been looking for my phone for...
In Dax's domain, we see all. So we always know what our cars are worth.
All of them?
All of them. Value surge, trucks up 3.9%.
That's a great offer.
I know. Sell?
Sell.
Track your car's value with Carvana Value Tracker today.
It's February 17th, 1870, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
So it was on this day that MPs gathered at the House of Commons to propose implementing a tough new law. You must go to school, unless you live quite far from the school, or you're over the age of 10, or your local authority would rather you didn't leave your job on the farm. Because actually, the Education Act of 1870 would prove to be a pretty toothless law.
But isn't it extraordinary that it took so long for what we would think of as a faintly modern education policy, i.e. everyone deserves an education of some kind, to be discussed in the House of Commons? Yeah. The modern history of education policy actually started in Prussia in 1763, if you want to go back to the earliest example of compulsory education. But I think the real kind of domino effect that was spurring the Brits on was America.
And the guy who is leading the bill, William Edward Forster, it's funny to read his commentary on what's going on in the States, because he is there saying we really do need to make, spread schooling so that it's everywhere and everyone has access to it, but also B, make sure that people turn up. And he's saying, look at America, they have just made it compulsory. Admittedly, though, their version of it is almost completely toothless. And so when we set it up, we may want to actually have some sort of both carrot and stick. He wanted to give the stick of some sort of punishment, but also a carrot in the form of a diploma.
Yeah, and his comments sort of touch upon the reason that it hadn't happened before, which wasn't so much that there was a lack of access to schools. It wasn't unified, but there was a patchwork of charity schools and what were called dame schools, which would usually be a sort of middle-aged widow who would teach village children for a small fee in her own home. It was more the lack of demand, and the lack of demand came from the fact that for most families, however they felt about education, having their children working as part of the labour force was an economic necessity. There was no getting around it. Most families simply couldn't afford to not have their children working.
There was also opposition politically as well, on the basis of this is going to cost us too much money, just like there were with public sewers and banning child labour itself, all these things that feel like they must have been around for ages but actually weren't. There were those in Parliament who thought that free education for all would be a complete non-starter because they saw it as against their self-interest, frankly, or because they thought that state intervention on that level of finance was undesirable or impossible to achieve. And actually that's why it wasn't free for all to begin with. Mm-hmm. He actually defends, in presenting this bill to the Houses of Parliament, that parents should still pay for it if they can.
And that was actually part of what made the bill quite controversial, which was that although there had previously been demand for a unified school system throughout England and Wales, the main obstacle was the controversial issue of giving state funding to C of E schools. There were already a network of Church of England schools that would have needed to be brought in to this unified system. And so the nonconformist MPs didn't want any funding to go to them. So to placate them, the bill said that these new state schools would only teach a non-denominational version of Christianity, which was very disappointing to the Prime Minister William Gladstone, who was a very, very staunch Anglican.
The guy who led the amendment was called Cooper Temple, and he suggested that basically schools just teach the Bible and a few hymns. You're like, so that's the way that you water it down, by teaching the entire Bible? You're like, that's still quite a lot of content right there. But even despite this provision, it caused a massive split in the Liberal Party, who was the party in power at the time, and it cost them the next election.
And that's despite the fact that on this day, Forster starts his presentation by saying this shouldn't be a party matter. This is no longer something that should be divided along party lines. And he had some traction there as well because he was an industrialist. And this is the other thing. It wasn't a sort of bleeding heart thing, we should make sure that the poor children in Liverpool who receive no education whatsoever get something for their own good. It was so that they can go and work in a factory, because work in a factory with more knowledge and with more vocation, because at the moment we're just sending them up chimneys without a degree. This way, they can run the factories and we will solidify and consolidate our place as one of the leading industrial nations in the world.
And there was a kind of moral dimension to it as well. We know that this era of English history pretty much was moralizing on all fronts, but there was this idea that too many children out of school would lead to an immoral populace. And the stats are astonishing. Forster actually lays out how many kids are in and out of school. There's 700,000 kids aged 6 to 10 in school for 1 million who are out of school, and ages 10 to 12 there's 250,000 in school for 500,000 who are out of school.
Yeah, it was a confluence of so many factors. There was the religious aspect, the Victorian morality, wanting all children to be able to read the Bible. There was the empire was basically at its peak at this point, and that was providing opportunities to a lot of poorer children who might not have had the opportunity before to rise in the world as colonial administrators. There was also the 1867 Reform Act, which enfranchised some lower-class men, although not all, which led to more fears, like now they've got the vote, at least they have to be educated in order to use it wisely, and then fears that Britain would fall behind these other developing nations. As you mentioned, Prussia was leading the way in Europe, and then, of course, we always like to compare ourselves to what's going on across the Atlantic, don't like to feel like we're falling behind Americans. So it was just all of these factors coming together at the exact right time.
Although there was one thing that Britain did have, I think, on the United States, which was, well, to quote Forster, in making public provision for elementary schools, we hold that they ought not to be schools from which the public would be excluded, which seems so obvious, it's barely worth stating. But of course, wasn't the case in America until the second half of the 20th century because you had racial segregation.
Yeah, there's this astonishing bit as well where he says, he's talking about trying to set the schools up, and he says, I believe that the country demands from us that we should try to do at least two things, namely to cover the country with good schools and then to get parents to send their children to these schools. I'm aware indeed that to hope to arrive at these two results may be thought utopian. I was like, holy moly, they think it's some sort of utopia, particularly now that there are schools all over the country and it is completely compulsory for everyone to be in those schools, and every school kid grumbles about having to go to school. You're like, this is the utopia that he was imagining, and now kids are just like, sucks.
And a utopia that, like I said, is worth underlining is about training people for jobs. This is a report from James Bryce from 1895, which reads like something I think some modern-day Tories would still be very keen on. Primary education, quote, awakened the mind by teaching the child the rudiments, fine. Then secondary education taught children to apply the principles to their anticipated trade, quote, dye wool, weave cloth, design or construct a machine, navigate a ship, or command an army.
Wow.
Can you imagine the teachers being like, look, year 6, the jump from the wool dyeing you've been doing in junior school to the dyeing that you're going to be doing in senior school is very big, so you have to be prepared. Until the sort of 1600s, the idea that the common boy or girl required any level of formal schooling was not universally accepted at all. Basic reading and writing might be useful if you were the son of a tradesman or a craftsman who might run their own business someday. But the idea that being educated was good in and of itself wasn't particularly common at all. It didn't really start to change until the Protestant Reformation, when suddenly there was this idea that every Christian had a duty to read and understand the Bible, mostly in their own language. Previously, Catholic priests were in charge of interpreting the Latin Bible on behalf of their parishioners. So this religious imperative gave intrinsic value to the ability to read, although, interestingly, not the ability to write. In a lot of schools, until the Victorian era, reading and writing were considered completely separate disciplines and were taught separately. So you'd have schools where you might just learn to read and you might never learn to write.
It wasn't an immediate hit, this, though. I mean, Parliament did ultimately back it. And, there did become schools funded by the state. But there were many teething problems, not least because it's not as if children stopped working at that point. So the families that depended on their children to have a job just made them work outside school hours. So in fact, in a sense, what the government had done is increase the hours of their working day because they had to be at school between 9 and 3 and then go and do their factory job.
I found a weird statistic, which was that there were 11,000 day schools in 1870 and 2,000 night schools. And I was like, what is a night school? But it must be exactly that. It was schools set up for those children who wanted an education but couldn't attend during the day.
And as late as the 1930s, we were still at a situation where only 38% of 14-year-olds were enrolled in compulsory education and only 4% of 17-year-olds. I mean, I know 17 then was seen as being older than it is now and there were wars to fight. Nonetheless, that is living memory, isn't it? That's my grandmother was at primary school then.
And a lot of that was rooted in a reluctance to compel parents to send their children to school at the state level. Like, in terms of what the 1870 Education Act actually mandated, it gave local education boards the responsibility to set up enough schools to provide places for everyone in their district. But the power was completely concentrated in those individual boards. So they had the right to compel attendance, but they also had the right to not compel attendance. So, for instance, schools in rural areas tended to turn a blind eye for, seasonal absences so that children could participate in farm work. It would be a long process to which we would come to accept the government telling us at that top level, you absolutely have to do it and there will be legal consequences if you don't.
But ultimately we got to a position like we are today with the education budget at around £90 billion and all of us excellent at commanding armies and navies. So, well done the Victorians. We all know how to all die.
Tomorrow.
The British Empire is also extensive according to my childhood map.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/Retrospectors.